Thank you, Tim, and thank you to the SME for convening this important and relevant dialogue. It's great to be back in New York with my colleagues Neil Rigby and Grant Malensek. And thank you to Sherman and Sterling for hosting this event at your beautiful offices. So today I'm talking about the topic of quantifying the impact of social license for investment decision making. So on the agenda for today, we're going to talk about what is social license to operate very briefly. There's a lot of different definitions for it. How does it impact mining valuation, and how you can quantify and use it to impact your management and investment decisions. So what is social license to operate? I put up a number of nebulous synonyms here because that type of jargon seems to dominate the field. Basically, I think the best and most succinct definition of it is the acceptance of a company or its operations in the eyes of stakeholders. And who are stakeholders? Anybody that would like to be a stakeholder. You don't have to live near the project, have anything related to the project at all, have a stake in it, own any equity in it. Stakeholders are self-defined, so it's a very big pool of people. Our colleagues in the oil and gas industry tend to use above ground risk to talk about social risk for some reason. Of course, there's a lot of above ground risk that is not social and is very technical, but these are just some terms you run into a lot. Sustainable development is, of course, a very wide field that's evolving all the time and has been around since the beginning of time, basically. So here's some protocols and institutions that are very much involved in the development of the field. ICMM, most of us know. The E3 was developed by PDAC. It stands for Environmental Excellence and Exploration. And the two at the bottom are especially important for our discussion today because they have to do with criteria for obtaining capital for mining projects. Also, I picked these four because I didn't want to scare you with all the organizations out there that are looking into this aspect of our industry. If I did want to scare you, I would just show you a slide like this, which shows the sort of circuitous path of the development of this discipline. There's many organizations involved in it, probably literally hundreds. But one point I wanted to make is, in case you can somehow read the font over there to the left, in 1987, when United Nations started talking about this in our field, it actually goes back a little further than 1987. Georgios Agricola was writing about mineland reclamation, community relations, that whole field in his book De Re Metallica, which was published in 1550. And when he talks about that topic, he's actually quoting the Bible. So we've been talking about this for a little while now. It's certainly not brand new. So more importantly, how can social license impact valuation and really access to capital in general? Just a few key points here. I heard a couple years ago the data point that there's $25 billion installed mining projects around the world specifically due to stakeholder conflict. And right away I thought, well, I can think of two projects alone that already exceed that, maybe things like Conga and Pascua-Lama. So I would bet that it's 3 to 4 times that is the value of projects that are sitting around undeveloped due to social problems. There's been a number of studies about this. People like me and others are constantly trying to quantify the effects of stakeholder conflict on valuation in our industry. So a study out of Harvard and University of Queensland found that on average for a larger project, 3 to 5 billion, the company should expect to suffer $20 million a week in delays due to stakeholder conflict. So this one, I tried very hard to summarize a complicated study that came out of Wharton. Professor there looked at 19 publicly traded gold juniors trying to figure out the correlation between their stakeholder situation and their valuation. Ended up finding out that 2/3 of the predictive value of their publicly traded equity came from stakeholder issues, and only 1/3 was attributable to their reserves under the ground. Then there's the rise of SRI, socially responsible investment, which has been gaining ground at an alarming pace almost, at least in the US, to the point where now 1 out of every 6 institutionally managed dollars in the US is officially classified as SRI. meaning that the institution has incorporated into their investment policy ESG, environmental social governance principles. So that adds up now to about 6.7 trillion of SRI dollars in the US. Another study found that non-core assets, those that make up less than 10% of the company income, once they develop social problems, start demanding more than 80% of management time. And that's up and down the chain of command, from the CEO all the way down to people on the ground that are trying to deal with the community. And lastly, kind of a depressing and interesting data point is a study was done over a 5.5-year period that counted up $200 billion in write-downs on the balance sheets of mining companies. And when I first saw this, I thought, well, it's probably due to the downturn in the bear market. But it's not, because the 5 years that they captured were 2008 through mid-2013. So at least in the gold price, that was most of the run-up. So it's not the bear market explaining this alone. And actually, when you look at the companies that top that write-down list, you right away think of big projects, huge projects that are stalled around the world due to stakeholder issues. I mean, things like Pebble is another one of them. So social issues are wreaking havoc on balance sheets as well. And then now we have to compete with ETFs for equity in this market. And I just dropped in the chart of the GLD over 5 years, and it shows that the GLD ETF retained better value than any of the gold majors. Royal Gold spiked at the end over it barely, but royalty companies and streaming companies also suffer due to social issues in their valuation. So it's hard to compete with a bar of gold that's sitting in an air-conditioned vault in London, because it doesn't have to get a permit, it doesn't deal with strikes, it doesn't have to satisfy any stakeholders, it doesn't have to obtain social license. It's just worth 1/10 of an ounce of gold no matter what. So it becomes more attractive to a lot of investors. Also, say you have a socially flawed project. You might just want to sell it. Well, if you're going to do that, it's going to be sold at a big discount. Probably the biggest bargains in the industry are projects that are known to have stakeholder problems. Here's one example. So Teck had owned the Morelos gold property in the Guerrero state of Mexico, and were not able to advance it, had been reporting a number of community blockades, and really couldn't advance the project. Torex Gold came in and bought it and took a different approach, ended up hiring a cultural anthropologist to try to get to the bottom of what is this conflict. And long story short, last September in their 43-101, they reported approaching a 10x gain in that investment. So if you can unlock the social problems, there's a lot of opportunity out there in the smoldering ruins. But if you can't unlock them, it's a serious problem. So this, you might think, oh, so they obtain their social license and it's a happy ending, right? Well, not exactly. At any time, social license can expire. And just a few weeks ago, the road to Morelos was blocked by 3 different communities, saying that the company hadn't met their commitments for certain compensation payments. And we hear this all over the world all the time. And so how long is this going to last? It's probably been cleared up for now, but you never know. Just because one day the community's bought into your project, they might buy out tomorrow or in an hour. And then important for our industry is, of course, time to market. Metals prices are very volatile. So when the price environment looks good, you'd like to get your project up and running right away. Sometimes a big hurdle to that is stakeholder issues. In this case, it looks like Anglo American did not get a bargain from MMX when they bought Minas Rio for over $5 billion. As they found out, and perhaps the due diligence didn't capture this, but they might have seen that they were going to face a very different stakeholder environment. MMX had very strong relationships with the communities all along the route of the pipeline and the mine. But then again, of course they had strong relationships. They hadn't asked them for anything yet. They hadn't impacted them. So one question is, are they, the community loves the project now. Are they going to keep loving it after we buy it? What are we going to do to change their minds for the positive or negatively? Anyway, most of us know about this project. The cost more than doubled from the initial budget, and there was a 2-year delay. Not a good 2 years to be out of the iron ore market. Okay, so what we've all been waiting for. What are some tools to quantify and use social license to operate in management and investment decisions? So I'll talk about a couple that we have in development. One is using your existing data taken to the next level of value-added analysis. A lot of time is put into gathering data for environmental impact statements and other project development reports, also different audits, due diligence reports. And frequently that data, actually usually that data, once it accomplishes its intended purpose, whether that's obtaining a permit, obtaining financing, advancing the project in some way, gets put on a shelf or on your hard drive and sits there. And all that time and money you put into capturing that data it's not wasted, but it's not maximized either. I'm saying there's a way to operationalize all that data you've collected about the community to help inform your decisions. So we'll look at that in a moment. And then the other one is non-traditional data. So on the traditional data, my colleague, Catherine McCallum, in our UK office, has developed a social license index. And so not only does it give you a number that on a scale that shows you how much social license index you have, but it actually produces some actionable information about how you can fix this project, or maybe it's not fixable. It basically generates a graphical representation of what are the strengths and weaknesses of this particular project along 5 important axes. So the results of this, if used correctly, is that you've got a roadmap for management of where do you allocate resources. There's a million things you could spend money on in terms of community relations. Where are the real weaknesses? And then also for an investor, you can look at these graphics and say, you know, can this problem be fixed? Should we walk away from this? Or is there an easy fix, so we'll realize a value like Torex? Or is there a not easy fix, and we'll have more of a Minas Rio experience? So here's an example of what the graphical representation looks like. So what we'd like to see on the left is a blue shape in the middle that's a nice, big, evenly shaped pentagon. Not really something like this. If it's an evenly shaped tiny pentagon, then it means it's doing poorly in all areas. So that's not great either. So what we can see here is along these various axes, the community is pretty strong financially. You know, it's not a poverty-stricken community. On the social aspect, that's meant to capture how cohesive is the society, how well does the local government function, are they able to make decisions and stand behind those decisions. Physical, we're getting an infrastructure here. Are there sufficient roads? What about healthcare clinics, educational facilities, etc.? Natural is the natural environment. What's their water supply like? Biodiversity, you know, is there a sacred forest nearby that you're not going to be allowed to touch? And then human, this is showing pretty weak development on the human axis, which means that the workforce is probably not very well trained, doesn't have a lot of skills to be working perhaps either for your suppliers or for the mine itself. And then this is just looked at in a different way on the right-hand chart, where it's basically ranking the project strength and what's its impact on the community, what's the company doing in terms of corporate responsibility initiatives, which captures a whole host of environmental social problems, and then what does the community perceive it to be. So this is coming from traditional data sources that I mentioned before, right? This is a way of capturing EIS and other reports. And you know, other ways that are traditional of capturing community sentiment around your operation are the traditional things like community consultations, one-on-one meetings. You need to have a grievance mechanism, things like that. But what we've all found out over time is in one-on-one meetings, people don't often or always tell you exactly what they think and exactly what they're planning around your project, if they really do oppose it or not. So the non-traditional data that I'm going to talk about is there is a place where people do speak their minds freely and say what they really think, and every comment that they make is public, and there's 305 million people in this promised land, and it's called Twitter. It's all over the world, and people in all sorts of communities have access to it. You don't have to have an iPhone or an Android phone to be able to use Twitter or a computer anywhere near you. You can have a $3 flip phone and you can text to tweet. So the lowest tech people out there have great access to Twitter. Unlike Facebook and other social media platforms, most tweets are public. So it's not just your friends or your followers, et cetera, who can see what you say. It's anybody who logs on to Twitter. And then the great thing about Twitter is Twitter usage, the penetration among adult internet users worldwide is highly correlated with economy's mineral dependence. So it's a great tool to figure out what people think about mining. So what we've done in our pilot is we decided to look at the Samarco tailings dam failure and figure out what was the sentiment around that. What does it tell us? So we're looking for a few key indicators here. We don't just want to know what's the average sentiment around the incident, which is of course going to be negative, but who's influencing the debate. If you just log on to Twitter and put in a company name or a hashtag, you're going to see a huge laundry list of comments, but you don't really know who's influencing other people. There's a person who tweets 20 times a day about this. Is anybody reading their tweets? So our tool is a social media analytics tool that we've developed with a partner, and they're able to determine not only the sentiment, but they can sort comments in terms of whether they're negative or positive, filtering out sarcasm. So say somebody tweeted something that said, "Great job, BHP." The system knows that they don't mean great job. So it's able to detect nuances. And so what the map at the top is telling you is where is the Twitter activity about this topic. We can see, of course, it's greatest in Brazil. And then at the lower right, this is a list of every single tweet. You can get down that granular with this system. So it shows who's talking about them, what the date of that post was, and word for word what they said. This is, of course, in Portuguese. And we have a library of natural language analysis in many different languages. Over on the right, I'll zero in on that in a moment, but over on the right we have a chart of the y-axis is the influence score and the x-axis is the sentiment score. So there's a lot of kind of noise at the bottom. We can see these tiny dots that really aren't very influential. The most influential one is the most important stakeholder that you're going to want to reach out to, right? So to look at this a little more closely on the left here, so that turns out to be G1 in the Samarco debate, and G1 is the online form of O Globo, the biggest newspaper in Brazil. So not that unusual that they would be extremely influential. The larger bubble down below was Estado de Minas, another major newspaper in exactly that region of Brazil. So when you mouse over this, basically it tells you who's the person tweeting, what's their average influence score, everything about that person. So you're able to figure out, who should we be reaching out to? And are the people that say they support our projects the ones that really support it? There's a number of things you can figure out here, including everything from who's influencing it, country risk. But the important thing I put at the bottom is it has predictive capability. Samarco is not a great example of this because who knew that failure was going to happen? But when a protest is going to happen, there are people planning that. The dam failure was not planned. Protests are definitely planned. And the bigger and more damaging they are, probably the more time went into planning them by your opposition. So what this same partner that we're working with did is back in May of 2013, when there were the huge protests in Taksim Square in Istanbul against the Turkish government that ended up garnering international media attention, they were analyzing the tweets in that area and found a spike. Their analysis is so granular that they can look at activity within a 3-block radius around Taksim Square. They found this spike in negative sentiment, and you're probably thinking, well, of course, because there was a protest. No, that was 4 days before the protest. That was 4 days before any local Turkish media heard about it, and we have our Turkish colleague in our Denver office verify that, and he said, yeah, that was before it. So imagine if you could find out 4 days before people were going to shut down your project, that you might be able to do something to mitigate that, perhaps. So, in summary, social license to operate, as we know, has been shown to damage valuation of individual projects, companies, large portions of our industry and other industries. And if you want to try to determine, quantify, and benefit from social license to operate, we need to stop pondering and fretting. Those are the two main approaches to social license problems now, and they really don't do anything. The next thing you need to do is get quantitative about it. Our industry thrives on technical excellence and being quantitative about risk mitigation. So we need to take that same approach to social license if we want to get anywhere with it. And then finally, get actionable information and act on it. So those are my recommendations, and I'd love to hear any questions or comments.
Great, Maureen. Thank you so much.
How do you get in front? Would each mining company just look to monitor for their particular, or from just a general? Is there anything in that software where you would, again, to look after the fact and say, oh, wow, yeah, I could have figured that out? How do you know to look beforehand?
So you would set up a feed for your project. Say you're mining management. You would set up a feed for your projects, maybe every single one of them, or just the ones that would be really damaging if they went south from a social point of view. If you're an investor, any targets you're considering, you can start to monitor. And so obviously if you get this data after the fact, it's not as helpful. It still might be helpful in which stakeholders are influential, but you no longer can mitigate it if it's already happened. But what you do is you put this monitoring in place beforehand. And if you have unlimited money, do it for every single project. But since none of us do, you'd be selective about the sites that where you really have high stakes.
Maureen, how do you quantify the risk of violation of the social license? Numerically? I mean, would you discount the net present value of a project at the feasibility stage that looks like there's a lot of local sentiment against the project?
You could do that, but I think people already do that, and that's too much of a blunt tool, because you can just say, well, this project looks socially risky, let's hike up the discount factor by a little bit. So that's basically damaging the cash flows for the entire life of the project instead of looking at certain key periods in the development and trying to come up with a probabilistic cost that you could put right into your NPV. So you're basically modeling it like you would any other cost. What's the probability of a delay at this point in the project, and how long might it be? And it's kind of anybody's guess, but there's also ways to predict it. So just modeling it into the NPV is, I think, a much better way than kind of an arbitrary increase to a discount factor. But either one's better than nothing.
So Maureen, in the example of Anglo buying MMX's property, if SRK was engaged, what kind of report would you have done in advance, and how effectively do you think you would have identified that risk?
So would have looked at what can change once the new owner takes over. What's the source of the good stakeholder relations that the seller has? Is it because that they've never had to ask any hard questions? And then try to look at, gather some intelligence about what is stakeholder analysis. We have got people and associates on the ground all over the world, have some people maybe interview some stakeholders and find out, oh, if a pipeline comes through here, how do you feel about that? Would you be for it? What kind of compensation might you be looking for? That type of thing, just to gather some intelligence on what are these risks. And are you going to miss things? Of course, but we also miss technical challenges. So, and maybe that was done, but it doesn't seem like it was done, because right away, all of these key stakeholders had a big problem. Could be just that it was Anglo-American. Some management teams just seem cursed, no matter what they do. So,
Thank you, Maureen, for an excellent
Thank you.
presentation. And Bill, likewise, your discussion of valuation was excellent.